I know there isn't a great deal known about this case, and it should be known. It's one of the few cases that I've encountered that combines in a single case a history of injustice abroad with injustice at home. I know most of you are familiar with the 42-year history of the United States' attempt to overthrow the revolution in Cuba. But I want to go back just to June of 1998. After the first half-decade in the 1990s, when Cuba, weakened by the collapse of the Soviet bloc, was subjected to a series of attacks emanating from the United States. And the Cubans had frequently sought to provide the United States with information that it had pertaining to the terrorist network that existed in Miami and from where these attacks were launched. Finally, in June of '98, the United States sent the number 2 man in the FBI together with a delegation to Havana. And they sat down with their Cuban counterparts, and they were given 4 large loose-leaf volumes of information, each volume over 300 pages in length. They were given 2 hours and 40 minutes of videotape and 8 cassettes of audio tapes that had been compiled on the terrorist network that existed and was operating out of Miami. The FBI delegation told the Cubans, thanked them for the information, and told them they would get back to them within 2 weeks. The FBI did not get back to them. Instead, within 90 days, they had rounded up a group of people in southern Florida known as the WASP network, who were gathering this information on the criminal activities of these groups in southern Florida, and they charged them with espionage in the United States for their work. 5 of them went on trial. The trial, as I mentioned, lasted 7 months. And at the conclusion of the trial, they were found guilty of all 26 counts against them. 3 were sentenced to life, and 2 were sentenced to, respectively, I believe it's 17 years, I think 19 years. Now, the question is immediately, what were these charges? And how could these charges be sustained? The charges involved mainly complaints that these 5 Cubans failed to register as foreign agents. Those counts each take a 10-year sentence. But there were 2 large counts, which were the operative counts of the indictment. One count was a conspiracy to commit espionage, and the other count was a conspiracy against one to commit murder.
Gerardo Hernandez was railroaded into Lompoc prison for conspiracy to commit murder and espionage. He is serving 2 life terms.
I emphasize conspiracy because, as you know, and the government argued this in writing in their papers, they don't have to prove espionage. Indeed, they conceded at the end of the trial that they did not prove espionage. They only have to prove, as you know, in a conspiracy, that there was an agreement to commit espionage. And that's what they sought convincing a jury drawn from Miami that although we can't prove it, folks, there certainly must have been an agreement to do it. And on the second count against one of the five, which was charged as a conspiracy to commit murder, again they said we only have to show that there was an agreement to commit murder. And what murder are they talking about? Are they talking about a murder that occurred in the United States? No, the government said we have no proof that any of these five ever had guns, ever had explosives. They weren't here for that purpose. They were here to gather information on the terrorist network in the United States. Well, how did they say there was a conspiracy to commit murder? They pointed to a February 24th, 1996 shoot-down of two planes from Brothers to the Rescue, which occurred over Cuban waters. And they said one of them must have been involved in a conspiracy to cause that shoot-down because he had information that they believed that it was about to occur. At the end of the case, after 7 months of evidence, the government took an emergency appeal to the 11th Circuit called a writ of prohibition, in which they said to the 11th Circuit, we cannot prove the charge of murder if the judge gives the instruction that she intends to give. And the 11th Circuit rejected the writ. The judge gave the instruction. The government said, we have an insurmountable obstacle. We can't prove this. And this jury in Miami convicted just the same, after the prosecutor conceded in a written paper that he didn't have proof. How did that happen? I think many of you know from the Rene González controversy something about the atmosphere in Miami. I thought I knew, but I didn't know enough. I didn't know what America's Watch found in their 1994 investigation of Miami, that Miami exists quite apart from the United States as a separate entity in which everything revolves around a single political concept, and that concept is a hostility, a deep ingrained hostility toward anything involving Cuba or the Cuban government. And we did see that in the Rene González controversy. So the prosecutor, of course, placed this case in Miami. And the five went to trial essentially before the exile community. There are over 600,000 Cuban exiles in the Miami-Dade area. And I just want to read to you briefly from a book, not my favorite book, but on this subject they're probably right, a book called Cuba Confidential, which is a kind of a history of a series of scandals. But this is what she had to say about Cuba, about Miami. A Cuban American is the head of the Miami-Dade Public University, the head of the community college system, the state's attorney, the county police chief, the fire chief, the mayor of Miami, the publisher of the Miami Herald, the presiding partner of the largest law firm, the superintendent of the county public schools, the executive mayor of the county itself, and all endorse the hard line on Cuba. Otherwise, they would not have achieved their positions. There was a survey done for the defense, and the survey proved fair trial could not be had in Miami-Dade. The judge rejected the survey, and she rejected the arguments that the case be changed in venue out of Miami. And so they went to trial before a Miami jury. And what happened? On the first day of the trial, the families of the victims of the shoot-down held a press conference on the steps of the courthouse with members of the prospective jury present. And at the end of the first day, The jurors reported to the judge that there was a newspaper in the jury assembly room that was open to an article, a very damning article, about this case. Who put that newspaper in the jury assembly room? We still don't know. But the regional director of the Cuban American National Foundation, the most hostile organization against Cuba, was in that jury panel. And when he came into the courtroom, he was behaving in such a bizarre fashion that the judge called him right up to sidebar and questioned him, and in the record she said she was astonished at the rage that this man demonstrated. That was the atmosphere on the first day of the trial, and it continued throughout the trial. The defense succeeded in removing, miraculously, every Cuban American from that jury. But it didn't matter, because, and I'm quoting now from the voir dire, the foreman of the jury, when asked what was his attitude about Cuba, said, "I regard Fidel Castro as a communist dictator, and I will be pleased on the day he's removed." That was the foreman. The number 2 juror agreed with that sentiment and acknowledged that his daughter has been with the FBI for 10 years as an employee. The number 3 juror also agreed with the sentiment and said that she worked for the state's attorney's office in the criminal division, and she sat. And so on it went through 12. And that was the nature of the jury that heard this case. Only in Miami was a street named after the victims of the shoot-down. Only in Miami was a plaza named after the victims of the shoot-down. Only in Miami was a monument erected in the county building in honor of the victims. All of these things happened in this one venue where the trial took place. None of them happened in any other venue in the United States. I want to give you an example of what was the nature of the espionage. I want to read to you from the transcript, just one page. This is a report back to Cuba from, I believe, Roberto's brother, Rene.
Rene González infiltrated terrorist anti-Cuba groups in Miami to warn the island of possible mercenary attacks. He is serving a 19-year sentence in McKean Prison, Pennsylvania.
And this is what he reported. This is the espionage that was taking place. On March 16th, Andres Alvarino, who works in the prisons and is a member of the National Guard in Miami, told me about having a project with the Cuban American National Foundation to form a group of 40 men with professional military experience, persons on active duty in the military branches or ex-military personnel, in order to execute paramilitary missions against Cuba. It would be a force of mercenaries without ties to any other counter-revolutionary group of Cubans, and which they consider to have been penetrated. They would be paid commissions, and they would have life insurance policies of $100,000 US for their families. Roberto Martin Perez will be in charge of the project for the Cuban American National Foundation. One of the financial promoters, Enrique Casas, a Cuban millionaire and an ex-US Army officer who has a boat company and arms deposits in Honduras, was a member of the Nicaraguan Contras. This was what was sent back to Cuba from this group. And this is what forms the basis of the espionage counts. Reporting on terrorist operations within the United States. As you know, violations of the U.S. neutrality laws. Now, they knew that these attacks coming from the U.S. were probably coordinated with the military side in the U.S. So one of the 5 was assigned, my client, to watch the military activities on a Navy training base called Boca Chica to see if there was any buildup of any U.S. forces that would support operations by the mercenaries.
For observing plane flights to see if an attack on Cuba was imminent, Antonio Guerrero is serving a life sentence in Florence, Colorado.
And so the government pointed to the fact that he was on a military base and that he was watching for possible buildups. But if you know the espionage laws, it is not a violation of our espionage laws if you observe publicly available information and send it to a foreign country. The espionage laws are only triggered if the information that you're sending to another country is information that's secret and protected. The government acknowledged in this case that there was no classified information that it had received from any of the five. Nonetheless, they were convicted of a conspiracy because the government said they were doing this, someday they would probably get classified information. They haven't yet, but they will. And this jury, of course, bought that argument. This is not a simple task to visit the Cuban Five, who are serving 3 of them life and 2 of them long sentences. Why? Because the government put 1 in California, 1 in Wisconsin, 1 in Pennsylvania, 1 in Texas, and 1 in Colorado. And so if you go to visit them, as Ralphie has, and as others have, you must take a considerable period of time to do the entire circuit. And I might say, and maybe Roberto will address this, 2 of them are not permitted to see their wives because the government will not grant them visas to come visit. So they're essentially doing a life sentence without the opportunity to see their family in the case of 2. It's tragic as an injustice. We're filing appeals to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Those of you who are familiar with the 11th Circuit know how difficult this is going to be. But something happened. And when you're fighting a case on a just cause, things always happen. Things that you don't expect happening. A year after this trial ended, and it ended in June of the year 2000. A year after it ended, 2001. A year after it ended, the same United States attorney who prosecuted the 5, who's no longer a United States attorney, he's now the Assistant Attorney General of the United States. But the same prosecutor filed in Miami a request for a change of venue because he was defending Mr. Ashcroft and a suit brought by a Mexican-American who was claiming job discrimination, which arose tangentially out of the Rene González episode. So the United States attorney went into the same U.S. District Court that we were tried in and said this case must be transferred out because there is a Cuban political nexus to this case, and when there's a Cuban political nexus, you cannot get a fair trial in the Miami-Dade district. It's remarkable because the defense in our case relied on one case, a magnificent case, by Judge Wisdom of the Fifth Circuit, which is the predecessor of the 11th. And Judge Wisdom had a case where an African-American minister was charged in Texas with a crime for leading a sit-in at a lunch counter, and he was tried and convicted, and the case was appealed, and then when it got to the Fifth Circuit, Judge Wisdom said, there is no pretrial publicity in this case. Every juror said they could be fair and impartial, but this town in Texas is a town which, because of its pervasive beliefs and attitudes, could not afford an African-American minister charged in a civil rights activity a fair trial. So the defense in our case said, this is identical. 5 men who are agents of the Cuban government charged with conspiracy to commit espionage or murder cannot get a fair trial in Miami-Dade. They could in possibly any other venue, but not here. And what did the government answer in that case? The government said, this case out of Texas is no precedent because this Texas town was a small town. Miami is a large, diverse metropolitan area which could filter out prejudice. And the judge bought it. And so venue stayed in Miami-Dade. But this year, when Mr. Ashcroft was a defendant in a civil case, and the government claimed he couldn't get a fair trial, 3 times in their brief they cited the very same case. Miami, all of a sudden, in 1 year went from a large metropolitan area, it shrunk to a small community. And we are now about to go back into court while the case is pending in the circuit under what's called a Rule 33 motion for a new trial, claiming there's newly discovered evidence. And what is the newly discovered evidence? The obvious deception and misrepresentation that the prosecutors made when they fought against a venue change in our case. And the proof of it is the position they took in the Ashcroft case. The important thing is that the case received national attention and national support. Miami has its own little thing going here, and it will not survive the light of day if it's nationally exposed. They were hurt by the Rene González case, and this case is a tack on to that case. What should be exposed here now after 9/11? The fact that these 5 men were prosecuted, why? They were prosecuted because the government of the United States saw that they were getting a little too close to our terrorists. Once the government saw those 4 volumes and saw what these men had gathered, the government moved very quickly to protect our own terrorists in Miami. And this case is entirely intertwined and linked with that process. And this case gives us an opportunity not just to fight for justice in their cause, which is certainly worthwhile, but to expose the fact that we were also a host country to a group of terrorists known to us, and we even moved to protect them by accusing 5 people who were what? Conducting an anti-terrorist operation in the United States. And I just want to close with this, and I don't often do this, but I want to quote from a Justice Department document. And this is a document which was filed by a Deputy Attorney General when a man by the name of Bosch asked to be granted asylum in the United States, and the Justice Department opposed asylum because Orlando Bosch was involved in the bombing of an airliner in which 73 people were killed, a Cuban airliner. And he was involved in a number of other acts of terror and violence. And he was in the United States, and the INS was seeking to deport him as an undesirable person. And I will just want to quote what the Deputy Attorney General wrote in a 20-page document in reviewing the case of Juan Bosch, based on Orlando Bosch. Based on all the information available to me, both confidential and non-confidential, it is clear that for more than 30 years, Bosch has been resolute and unwavering in his advocacy of terrorist violence. He has formed and led organizations whose purposes include precisely the actions declared to be grounds for exclusion. Over the years, he has personally been involved in terrorist attacks abroad and has advocated and been involved in bombings and sabotage. The findings by the Justice Department. What happened to Orlando Bosch? On the recommendation of Jeb Bush, now governor of Florida, Bush Sr. overruled the Justice Department and granted this man who had bombed an airliner residence in the United States. He walks the streets of Miami as a free man. And this demonstrates for me the attitudes that were extant in this case, that the United States will even grant to a known and convicted terrorist a residential status in the United States in order to protect and at the behest of the Cuban American community, led in that instance by Jeb Bush. And I just want to close by saying Orlando Bosch had an attorney who represented him in this case. And that attorney is the grandson of Batista. And last month, Jeb Bush appointed him to the Florida Supreme Court. So that gives you some understanding of what this case is all about. Thanks.